Hey everybody, this is Brinna.
And this is Kirsten.
And we are Ready in Cars with
Theo Students.
We're driving around and discussing our thoughts on the Bible, and we have a lot of them.
Pop culture,
Political climates,
racial issues,
gender topics. Sometimes we'll have special guests with us, but always happy.
We are students at Drew Theological School.
Join us for conversations along the ride. Welcome back to Ready in Cars with Theo Students. Today we're talking about communion, and finally we have a special guest with us. Yay!
This is Rick.
That's Rick. Yo.
And this is Leif.
That's Leif.
Leif is a second-year MDiv student at the Theo School. He also happens to be Lutheran.
Legendary local liberal Lutheran.
What?
Lutheran swag.
Lutheran swag.
Oh, God.
What's up?
To the Lutheran swag.
Oh, wait, that's not mine.
And Rick is the partner of Olivia Cunningham DiAgosino, who is also a second-year student at the Theo School. Rick happens to be Catholic. We thought it would be interesting to have different theological and denominational viewpoints on communion and what it means to us and our denominations.
Our main text for today is Matthew 26, verses 26 through 29. It is the NRSV, Jewish Annotated New Testament. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." So communion, as we specifically read, is written in Matthew 26. There are also places where it's served in Mark 14 and Luke 22. So those are the main places in the Synoptic Gospels. And then in the epistle section of the New Testament or Christian Testament, communion is referenced in Acts 2, 1 Corinthians 10, and 1 Corinthians 11. Obviously, we know from reading the scripture that bread and wine and community meals are a very important thing throughout this time period and throughout this community, and so that's referenced in different places in Mark and John and 1 Corinthians. But interestingly, communion is not written in the Gospel of John. So as we discussed in a previous video, John was likely compiled by different sources, and so whenever people were putting that together, did they just leave out communion, or was it intentional, or were they like planning ahead but forgot to put in the reference later?
Or was John gluten-free? That's
also an option. In looking through the scriptures that have communion specifically written or reference it, there are many words that translate to koinonia. So specifically, fellowship and sharing directly relate to the Greek word koinonia, which just means communion, and it's a community shared rituals and values. And participation in the Lord's Supper is a sign that one belongs to the community. So communion is a sacrament, which just means a sacred moment. It's a means of grace. Communion isn't a memorial service for a dead Jesus. We're not just sitting around mourning, but it's a way to celebrate the resurrection, a way to give thanksgiving for Christ's resurrection, and basically a call to action as we celebrate the living Christ among us.
One of the things that I also love about the UMC practices around communion is that we always use grape juice, and the reasoning behind that kind of over time has become, no matter your age, you are welcome to take communion, but also wherever life has kind of taken you, if you've found yourself in like addiction type circumstances, that's a part of who you're welcome, and there's no pressure to not take communion or like questioning if you are able to do it or not based on your experiences. So I appreciate churches. When I visited Leif's church, and typically you have wine there, like Lutheran, like the Lutheran theological kind of realm, it's wine typically. But I appreciate that you had both. Like the church that Leif is serving at has both wine and grape juice for the people, those choices that they have to make, and also places like Drew that offer for both. I was born and raised in the United Methodist Church. So we have our issues, but Same. We have our issues, but one of the things that I really have always loved and cherished about the UMC is communion and the way that we celebrate communion, and the special meaning that it's held in my faith community and also just for me personally. So the UMC has an open table. In our liturgy, typically it's announced that this is an open table, and all who wish to partake in communion are welcome to. You need not be a member. Typically it said you need not be a member of this church or any church to take communion. So that's always been really special to me, and has been important to how I do church and how I live out my faith. So in research for this episode, I was like, wait a minute. All right, so now we have an open table, but what did Wesley think? What were John Wesley's original thoughts and ideas as it pertained to communion and how we do that and who's allowed to do that? So I did a little bit of research, and I found some of his sermons that are just on the UMC website. But I found his sermons, and it expresses that all are welcome.
In John Wesley's sermon titled The Duty of Constant Communion, Brinna found some quotes from him, which are interesting. He says, "I am to show that it is the duty of every Christian to receive the Lord's Supper as often as he can. Let everyone, therefore, who has either any desire to please God or any love of his own soul, obey God and consult the good of his own soul by communicating every time he can, like the first Christians." Which sounds great, except that the patriarchy was real strong, and still is in a lot of cases.
So I was raised as a Catholic, Roman Catholic, and my upbringing was essentially, I didn't really have any diversification of different religions. We'd receive communion, you go through your communion classes, and then you're able to, take the bread and the wine at church.
How long were your classes? How long were you in classes? Do you remember?
Communion was second grade. So I was 8, 9 when I was able to accept communion. And then I got confirmed in the 8th grade, so I was 13 or 14. Then, as mentioned before, my partner is Olivia, and she's a Methodist. So as I got older and as we started dating, I went to church with her, and then discovered that I was unable to accept communion in other churches. I talked to my priest, and essentially I kind of found out that I wasn't allowed to go to the Methodist church and accept the bread and grape juice there. I had to, I was only able to do it at the Catholic church. And then I learned further on, as Olivia's theological pursuit diversified, therefore my theological pursuit diversified, there's something called an interfaith blessing, which I'm able to receive. And I cross my hands over my chest, and so I'm only able to receive communion at a Catholic church. Any other church, I'm unable to receive communion. So you get in a line, you wait, you take it up to the priest. The priest tends to have small wafers in a dish, and the dish is generally out of a really nice metal. And you receive the body, and then you step over, and then so you've eaten the bread already, and then you take a sip out of the chalice. We tend to not dip. I know that's common elsewhere. Every now and again, also, people tend to receive it on their tongues instead of in their hand. That's also common. And then the chalice as well. Sometimes they'll lift the chalice to your mouth, so you don't touch the chalice or the bread. Every now and again. Generally, only people who are older would receive like the body on their tongue. And they'll just they'll go up, and instead of putting their hands up, they'll stick their tongue out. It's like It's pretty funny.
When I was in 3rd grade at a Catholic church, my best friend at the time, it was her first communion, and coming from my Methodist 3rd grade self, I was so excited because I love communion. So when it was time for everyone to take communion, I went up with everyone, but I didn't know that I wasn't allowed to take communion there. So when I got to the front of the line, my friend's mom didn't tell me that I couldn't, because I live in a small town. The priest knew me, and he's like, "You're not Catholic, you can't take communion." And I was devastated. I was so sad, and then mad. And then I went back to my pastor the next day, and I told him all about it, and I was so mad. It's okay, Brenna, calm down. So I've always had this, like, since then, my love of communion has, like, grown in the Methodist Church.
The earliest kind of memories I have of communion was before I went through the first communion. So before, like, 3rd grade, and getting the blessing, like, that was kind of a special thing for me, that the pastor would, like, cross my forehead and bless me. I like that.
I love that.
I love that. And then I went through the communion classes, which I think was part of what my church was, like a series of, like, things called faith stepping stones. So you would do it with your family, like, learn about, communion, and then you do it at the end of confirmation, end of high school. I remember learning in, like, AP European history, we were learning about the Reformation and, like, the arguments around communion. And then I thought, oh, that's so absurd that, like, the body and blood of Christ would be there. And so I was pretty agnostic about what actually happened. But now that I've learned about, the importance of, consubstantiation, it's like, yeah, this is really cool that Jesus' body is in my body now. It's, one in body, literally, and it has that materiality to it.
I remember that until about age 10, the different churches that my family was in would serve communion through small plastic cups and wafers, and I thought that it was weird, but I didn't really have a reason for thinking it was weird. Around the time that I was 10, 11-ish, my family was part of a church plant, and at that time the church decided that all forms of baptism and all forms of communion would be valid, but that the church would do, thank you, the church would do intinction, and that it would be served every Sunday. So it became a regular part of my life, and I appreciated it at the beginning, but then I think over time it just became a ritual instead of something symbolic. So around the time that I was 15, I began getting involved in an ecumenical youth ministry. And so because of that, I was super influenced by lots of different denominations. And about 2.5 years ago, I think it was, I was at one of the ecumenical youth ministry services, and the person who was leading communion looked around and realized there were no other ordained clergy in the room, and he asked me to serve with him, and I was like, aw crap, I am unprepared for this. And so I held the grape juice, and it was like one of the coolest moments of my life. A thing that I really loved about the church that I attended for about 5 years before moving to New Jersey is that everyone was welcome at the table. The church is currently non-denominational, which probably adds to my confusion on where I am on so many things. But a thing that I loved about it is that, like, kids could come and they knew that it was a special moment, and even if they didn't fully understand, they were still welcome to come up. I specifically think of this one little girl who's about 3, and she would take communion multiple times, and like at first it was like, oh, that's weird, why is she going a second time? But she was just so excited, and she wanted to participate in the life of the church. And that church is very intentional about including kids, and so it wouldn't be any surprise to have a drummer who's 10 years old, or like 6 and 7-year-olds singing along with us on stage. So I love how communion is just another accessibility point to include others.
Catholics don't believe in consubstantiation, they believe in transubstantiation. So we believe that the body and blood that we receive in communion, in the Eucharist, is literally the body and blood. So, which differs, I think, from every denomination's car. And personally, I'm not, like, my personal beliefs is, I guess I'm uncertain, you know, but I know that the Catholic Church believes that transubstantiation is, or that they believe in transubstantiation.
I have a growing pile of books that I've heard about or seen that I really, really want to read. That just is getting bigger and bigger because I don't have time to read. So this book, Take This Bread by Sarah Miles, is a book that I've been trying to read. But in preparation for this episode, I said, let me read at least a little piece of it. So basically it's, the author is a woman who was raised atheist, and never stepped foot in a church, never did anything churchy. But it talks about, she talks about her experiences leading up to and during the first time she ever took communion, during a pretty low point in her life, where she just felt like she needed to go into a church, and did, and took communion. She had no idea what was going on, didn't understand it, but it was really powerful. So I just read the one chapter on the chapter where she talks about that experience, and I liked it because it's only a 10-page chapter, and there are 8 tabs,
which is like the most Brinna.
No, 7. Yeah, I'm a fan of tabbies. So it's a really good book. At least that one chapter is. But I'm really looking forward to reading more. And it shows the power, at least for her, behind communion, but also the mystery that Kirsten was talking about a little bit. So Take This Bread, Sarah Miles. Great book.
This book is called Searching for Sunday by Rachel Held Evans, and her book, A Year of Biblical Womanhood, was one of the first books that I read in kind of getting me onto the bridge from how I was raised to more of my current belief system. So I really value what she's done and what she's written. And she goes through different sacraments in this book, which came out, I think, about 2 years ago. And she has a new one coming out this summer. But through the sacraments, of course, then she covers communion. And so I have some quotes that I would love to read. Remember how God became one of us? Remember how God ate with us and drank with us, laughed with us and cried with us? Remember how God suffered for us and died for us and gave his life for the life of the world? Remember? She also writes, this is what God's kingdom is like, a bunch of outcasts and oddballs gathered at a table, not because they are rich or worthy or good, but because they are hungry, because they said yes, and there's always room for more. The gospel doesn't need a coalition devoted to keeping the wrong people out. With each episode, we close from a quote by Bob Goff, in which he says, I used to think blank, but now I know blank. And so with the way that I was raised and in the traditions and cultures that were present at the time, I used to think that it wasn't literal in the way that we are taking communion, that it's Christ's body and Christ's blood, but that we were doing a literal practice to represent something that had happened before. And now I'm not so sure where I am, but I definitely believe in the symbolism of it, and I think symbolism is super important, and maybe that comes from a literary standpoint of needing to have symbolism to have readers engage, but it's also highly representative to my Christian faith.
I think communion was both special and kind of weird. Although I still think it's kind of weird, and I don't know quite all what it's about. I think there's always room for mystery.
And like, this isn't like something that has changed in the car ride. This is something that's changed over my life in pursuit of, I guess,
happiness.
Understanding. Should happen. Is communion was, the traditional way that I was taught, which was, the body and blood. You take the sip from the cup, and it's all these things. But now there's intinction, which is a word I recently learned, and I'll be honest, and other things like that. So now that I know there's other ways that other traditions do it, that differentiate from Catholics.
So I used to, along the same lines as what the others were saying, as a child, a young child, I remember thinking that, being a little creeped out that we were taking the blood and body of Christ. But now, over time, and more recently, coming to a better understanding as to what not only Methodists believe, but just churches and denominations in general. A more symbolic take on it has been really helpful to me. It's one of the metaphors that I love, is the symbolism behind communion.
This has been a self-serve love feast, not communion.
Yep.
So that we can all participate.
Thank you.
With Snap. Thank you for joining us again, and I want to thank Rick and Leif for coming along on the ride with us today. Next episode, we also have a special guest joining us, so we're real excited. So thanks for coming along, and you'll see us next time.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.